Before this story continues, let me make one thing clear. The story you are about to hear is fictional, created for entertainment and educational purposes, to reflect toxic family conflict and the inner journey of a woman who stayed silent for far too long. All characters' events and details are entirely fictional and are not based on any real person or real situation. The content may be supported by AI tools during the creative and production process. This story does not promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. It is told to invite empathy, reflection, and personal growth, especially for women who have sacrificed, endured, and been wounded inside their own families. Everything is built to be advertiser-friendly, aligned with YouTube community standards, and is not meant to target, accuse, or imply any real individual. If you have ever seen a piece of your own life in a story like this, stay until the end. And if something in your chest shifts, share what you felt in the comments, or follow the channel to keep walking with stories made for women who have been overlooked, yet still deserve to be understood and valued. Columbus, Ohio, October 2023. The air outside the hotel bit like weak coffee, not cold enough to snow, just cold enough to remind you that summer is over, and nobody is getting a redo. Inside the banquet room, everything was warm and polished, amber lights, soft background music, plastic name tags, and that familiar American smell of buffet food and expensive cologne trying to pass as success. I was on staff tonight. Elise, 24, waitress on a shift, quiet by habit, observant by survival. Frank, my stepdad, 56, loud in the way men get loud when they think it equals authority, always teaching lessons nobody asked for, always claiming connections. Linda, my mom, 54, the kind of silence that looks like peace until you realize it is just surrender wearing a sweater. Kyle, 27, the golden child protected like a family heirloom even when he chipped himself. Walter Kessler, 68, a man. Frank answered to a man who looked ordinary enough to disappear in a grocery aisle, but somehow every conversation leaned toward him when money was involved. I wore the uniform that made me invisible. Black slacks, white shirt, apron, hair, pinned back hands, moving on autopilot. The only thing that did not match was the thin ring on my finger, turned inward like a private habit, like I did not want the world to read it. I had just set down a tray of water glasses when I heard Frank say my name like it was a punchline. Elise. Hey, Elise. He said it louder the second time and people turned because Americans are trained to look when someone raises their voice in a room they did not pay for. I kept walking because that was what the job demanded and what my childhood had trained me to do. Keep moving. Do not give them your face. Frank did not let it go. He stood up halfway, waving his hand like he was calling a dog off a porch. Come here, let them see you. A few men at his table laughed, polite and shallow, the kind of laugh that means they want to belong more than they want to be decent. My throat tightened, but my body stayed smooth. I approached, holding the tray, steady eyes down, professional. Frank leaned back in his chair and looked me up and down like he was inspecting a bad purchase. Well, would you look at that, he said. Our little college genius, now bringing drinks. He made a small sound in his throat like he was savoring it. Guess that big plan worked out great. My mom stared at her napkin. Kyle smirked without even pretending to hide it. Frank lifted his glass a little as if offering a toast and said loud enough for the whole table and a few nearby tables to hear, "Do not let her fool you. She is working these shifts to pay off her mess, and we are done bailing her out." He tapped the table with one finger. Done. So, do not come to us asking for help when she texts you some sob story. She is lucky we even let her in the house. The word house landed like a boot on a throat, because he knew exactly what I still kept there. Not furniture, not boxes of junk, the things you cannot replace. The photo of my dad that still smelled faintly like old paper. The folder of documents I did not trust anyone else to touch. The small pieces of proof I had collected like splinters because I had learned that truth in a family like mine only counts if it is written down. A man in a blazer across from Frank chuckled and said something like, "Tough love." And Frank nodded as if he had just delivered a sermon. My hands did not shake. That was the strangest part. My pulse stayed steady, like my body had already decided the crying would happen later. Somewhere private, somewhere safe. I set the water glass in front of Frank, and he did not even thank me. He looked past me toward the room, already bored with my existence now that he had used it. For a second, the room got sharp around the edges, the clink of ice, the low murmur of networking, the forced smiles, the way people pretended not to listen while they listened anyway. I felt my mom's silence like a hand on the back of my neck. I felt Kyle's satisfaction like a thumb pressing on a bruise. And I felt something else too, something colder than anger. Clarity. I did not need to win with words. In my family, words were never currency. They were weapons, and Frank had more practice swinging them. What I needed was one more sentence from him, one more confident lie spoken out loud in the right air in front of the right ears. Because tonight in this banquet room the rules were different. Tonight the kind of truth that mattered was the kind you could point to, the kind that lived in paperwork, in disclosures, in signatures, in the quiet language of compliance that no bully can argue with once it is on the table. I turned away before Frank could add a second joke. My face stayed neutral, but inside something clicked into place like a lock turning. 3 German words. That was all I planned to say. Not a speech, not a confession, not a dramatic scene. Just 3 words whispered to the man Frank answered to, and the evening would pivot the way a heavy door pivots when someone finally pulls the right handle. If you stay with me, you will see exactly how a grown woman can take her dignity back without raising her voice. How a family can be forced to face its own reflection with nothing but rules and silence, and how a man who loved to humiliate me learned what it feels like to be exposed in public by the very system he thought he controlled. If you have ever been mocked by your own family for doing honest work, stay for 60 more seconds. Frank had a way of treating me like a spare tire. Useful only when something went flat invisible the rest of the time. If his truck needed a repair he could not cover that week, my phone rang. If the electric bill crept higher than he expected, he would clear his throat and say my name like it was a favor I owed him for existing. And the moment the problem was solved, the tone shifted. The same man who had needed me on Tuesday would look at me across the kitchen table on Wednesday and smirk, asking if I was still carrying plates for strangers who tipped in loose change. He never raised his voice. He did not have to. His disappointment was always delivered calmly, the way men like him believe authority should sound. Real jobs come with dental, he liked to say, usually loud enough for my mother to hear, but just soft enough that it could still be dismissed as a joke. I learned early that if I reacted, I lost. So I did what I had trained myself to do for years. I nodded. I rinsed my mug. I stayed quiet. The pattern was consistent enough that I could predict it. Frank needed me when money felt tight, or when something inconvenient required a younger body and quicker hands. He forgot me when his sense of control returned. What made it worse was not even the money. It was the certainty in his voice when he spoke about my life, as if it were a failed experiment he had inherited. He would lean back in his chair and tell stories about other people's kids, kids who had real careers, kids who worked 9 to 5 and earned respect. Then he would glance at me and add something about ambition or stability, or how the world was not kind to people who drifted. My mother Linda would stand at the sink and tell me not to make a big deal out of it. "You know how he is," she would say. "Just let it go." To people my age, that phrase sounds harmless. To anyone over 50, it lands like a verdict. Let it go means swallow it. Let it go means protect the peace at the cost of your own dignity. Every time she said it, something in me went quieter. The first escalation came wrapped in casual jokes. Frank began telling people I was still figuring things out, still finding myself, still not quite grown. He said it at family barbecues and during phone calls with relatives I barely knew. When someone asked what I did, he answered for me. "She waits tables," he would say, shrugging like it was temporary but inevitable. I learned to recognize the look that followed, pity mixed with relief. At least it is not my kid. I did not interrupt him. I did not correct him. Silence had become a habit, and habits are hard to break when they keep you housed. Then came Kyle. My younger brother by blood, but older by status in Frank's mind. Kyle lost his job in early spring and did not bother finding another one. He ran up his credit cards on gas, food, and things he did not need, then left the statements on the counter like someone else would deal with them. Frank never called him irresponsible. Frank never asked him about dental benefits. When Kyle forgot to pay his phone bill, Frank covered it without comment. When Kyle needed cash, my mother handed it over quietly. And when Frank was irritated by the strain, he turned to me. "Maybe if you had focused in school," he said once, "we would not all be stretched so thin." The sentence did not make sense logically, but it did not need to. It landed where it was meant to land. That was the second escalation. Favoritism was no longer subtle, it was structural. Kyle failed and was cushioned. I worked and was criticized. Kyle borrowed and was forgiven. I sent money to my mother every month and was still told I was lucky to be there. Frank's tone changed when he spoke to Kyle. Softer, encouraging. When he spoke to me, it sharpened, as if my presence reminded him of something unresolved in himself. I started timing my visits to avoid overlap. I kept my answers short. Inside, the hurt accumulated quietly. There are injuries that do not bruise but still limit movement. This was one of them. The third escalation arrived without humor. Frank stopped pretending. One evening, as I was gathering a few things from my old room, he stood in the doorway and mentioned the locks, casually, like it was a renovation detail. "Might change them soon," he said, "just to keep things secure." His eyes flicked to the closet where I still kept a small box. Inside were photographs of my father from before he died, old documents. I had never had the money to replace pieces of a life that existed before Frank decided who I was allowed to be. He did not threaten me directly. He did not have to. The implication hung there. Belongings can be leverage. Housing can be leverage. Silence is cheaper than confrontation. After that night, I began documenting everything. Not because I planned to use it. Not because I wanted revenge. It was instinct, the same instinct that teaches women to remember exits and men to remember receipts. I took pictures of bills of letters with dates of anything that might one day disappear. Then I deleted them from my gallery and stored them elsewhere out of habit more than strategy. I did not tell anyone. There was nothing to explain. Frank's behavior grew more precise. He stopped asking for help directly. He implied it. He made my mother ask. And every time I said yes, the disrespect sharpened, as if compliance confirmed his opinion of me. There is a particular kind of cruelty in threatening to erase someone from a home they still support. Frank perfected it. He would mention cutting phone lines, or talk about simplifying accounts, or joke about how grown adults should stand on their own feet. Each comment carried weight because it came from the man who controlled the space. Linda listened and said nothing. Kyle scrolled on his phone. I watched them both and learned something I should have learned sooner. This was not about money, it was about power, and Frank was inching closer to a point where power turns brittle. By the end of that month, I felt the pressure everywhere. At work, at home, in my chest when the phone rang. Frank was approaching his breaking point without realizing it. He believed the house was his. The narrative was his. The rules were his. What he did not know was that every threat he made pushed him closer to a moment where he would have to account for things he had never disclosed, and I was done absorbing the damage quietly. If you have ever been treated like a burden in your own family, you know the feeling. The moment when silence stops being survival and starts becoming surrender. Comment me too if you have ever lived inside that moment. I have never been a superhero, and I never pretended to be one. The truth is much less impressive and far more familiar. I left college halfway through because the numbers stopped adding up and the loans kept growing. Rent did not wait for diplomas, so I put on an apron and learned how to read a room the way some people read books. Serving tables teaches you more than balance and speed. It teaches you how systems behave when people think they are above them. I watched managers talk themselves into corners with policies they had not read. I watched guests argue about charges that were clearly printed at the bottom of menus. Over time, I realized something important. Most power does not come from shouting. It comes from knowing where the rules end and where they start. I began to read contracts the way I read menu fine print, slowly, twice. I learned how billing cycles worked, how clauses were written to protect one side and quietly pressure the other. None of this made me special. It made me prepared. And preparation looks a lot like patience when no one is paying attention. I did not learn German to impress anyone. I learned it because my grandmother spoke it when she was tired, and because language is what you reach for when you are trying not to drown. She came to the United States young, and carried her accent like a private room she could retreat into. When she died, the house felt quieter than it should have. Years later, when an opportunity came up to work as a nanny and trainee for a year in Germany, I said yes, without hesitation. Not because it sounded glamorous, but because it sounded like survival. I lived modestly. I cooked what I could afford. I learned the language because misunderstanding it meant missing trains, and missing trains meant missing work. There was nothing romantic about it. Fluency grows out of repetition and necessity. By the time I came back, German lived somewhere in my bones. I did not advertise it. I did not list it anywhere. It was simply there when I needed it, and invisible when I did not. Back home, life resumed its careful rhythm. I worked double shifts. I sent money to my mother. I avoided conversations that went nowhere. Inside, I kept things organized the way I always had. My finances were quiet and deliberate. I had a savings account that could get me out if I needed to leave immediately. Not luxury money, freedom money, enough to choose distance if staying became too expensive emotionally. I did not use it because my mother still lived in that house, and because walking away cleanly requires timing. People often assume restraint is weakness. In reality, it is strategy learned the hard way. There were signs that my life was not as small as Frank believed it to be. Small things. An email account with a domain that did not look like the ones everyone else used. I checked it sparingly. When it pinged, I read the subject line and closed it again. Not out of fear, but out of discipline. There were also names I recognized that Frank did not. Connections made briefly and professionally years ago that never needed explanation. I had crossed paths with Walter once before through a project that was structured boring and strictly procedural. I had not known him well. I did not need to. I remembered how he listened and how he asked questions that cut through assumptions. That was enough. At work, I kept my head down. I moved efficiently. I noticed details others missed. Like how people spoke differently when they thought no one important was listening. Or how certain guests deferred instinctively to one person at the table without being told. Authority reveals itself quietly if you know how to look. On nights when my feet hurt and my patience thinned, I reminded myself that uniforms are temporary. Systems are not. The apron came off at the end of the shift. The understanding stayed. At home, the tension remained thick but controlled. Frank continued his commentary. He still believed my life was an open ledger he could audit at will. Linda still asked me to keep the peace. Kyle still failed upward. I responded with minimal words and maximum observation. Every time Frank mentioned changing locks or cutting lines, I noted the timing and the context. Not to confront him, to understand him. People reveal their leverage when they think they have all of it. I did not tell anyone about my savings or my email or the connections I had made years earlier. Not because they were dangerous secrets, but because they were irrelevant until they were not. Power used prematurely evaporates. Power held patiently accumulates interest. I watched Frank grow more comfortable with his assumptions. I watched him confuse my silence for consent. I watched him underestimate the systems he believed he controlled. There is a moment in every long imbalance where one side becomes sloppy. That moment was approaching. I could feel it in the way Frank spoke more freely and threatened more openly. I could feel it in the way he stopped considering consequences beyond his immediate authority. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was structured by agreements he had not fully disclosed and rules he had not bothered to read. I did not need to push. I needed to wait. If you have ever judged someone by the uniform they wear without asking what they know, stay with me. You will understand soon. The banquet shift landed on a Thursday evening in October, the kind of corporate event that feels identical no matter which city hosts it. This one belonged to a regional logistics company celebrating a contract renewal. The venue was a mid-range hotel just outside Columbus, beige carpet, warm lighting, and a room arranged to look more impressive than it actually was. Plastic name badges waited on a folding table near the entrance. A buffet carving station steamed quietly at the side, the scent of roast beef mixing with hotel coffee. The master of ceremonies tested the microphone and rehearsed sponsor names with the careful seriousness of someone paid to sound important. I tied my apron, adjusted my badge, and took my assigned section without emotion. Event days are about rhythm. Walk, pour, clear, repeat. Nothing personal. About 20 minutes into service, I felt the shift in the room before I saw him. Frank's voice carries in enclosed spaces, especially when he is trying to perform. He arrived with Linda and Kyle, loud enough to announce their presence but restrained enough to look respectable. Frank wore the confidence of someone who believed the room existed to witness him. He scanned the tables until his eyes landed on me. There it was. The look that always came before trouble, not anger, ownership. He waved his hand like he was flagging down an employee instead of recognizing a person. I kept moving. I focused on refilling glasses and clearing plates, trusting muscle memory to do what my nerves could not. Frank did not let it go. When his table filled with colleagues and acquaintances, he leaned back in his chair and raised his voice just enough. "Hey, Elise," he called, smiling like this was a favor. "Come show them what you do." Heads turned. Conversations paused. The room adjusted its attention without realizing why. I walked over because refusing would have made it worse. Frank gestured toward me with an open palm, introducing me the way people introduce furniture. "She's working through things," he said. "Finding her way." The pause before the words did more damage than the sentence itself. Laughter followed, polite and uncertain. Frank's laughter came last and loudest. He was not done. He explained my job to people who had not asked. He told them how hard it is for young people these days, how some people do not aim high enough. He mentioned responsibility and discipline in a tone that suggested I lacked both. Linda stared at the table. When Frank looked at her expecting agreement, she gave a small nod and looked away. That was enough for him. Silence reads as permission to men like Frank. I stood there with a neutral expression, hands folded the way training teaches you. Inside, something tightened. Not surprise, recognition. This was the escalation I had expected. Kyle chimed in with a joke about tips and minimum wage. Frank laughed and patted his shoulder. The favoritism played out in real time, visible to anyone who knew how to see it. I did not respond. I did not defend myself. I waited for the moment to pass because moments always pass when you do not feed them. Frank dismissed me with a flick of his hand. I returned to my station, aware of eyes following me. The humiliation lingered in the air like heat. That was when Walter entered the room. There was nothing theatrical about his arrival, no announcement, no entourage. He walked in quietly and took in the space without claiming it. People around him adjusted their posture without knowing why. Conversations softened, chairs shifted. Authority often announces itself through absence rather than presence. Frank noticed him a few seconds later and straightened immediately. His voice dropped. His sentences shortened. The man who had just been loud and expansive became careful. That change spoke louder than any title could have. Frank approached Walter with a practiced smile, the kind reserved for people whose approval matters. Their exchange was brief. Frank nodded more than he spoke. Walter listened. He did not interrupt. He did not smile. He held his glass loosely and asked one question at a time. Frank answered quickly, a little too quickly, like someone afraid of silence. Watching them, I recognized the dynamic instantly. This was not camaraderie. This was deference. As I moved closer to refill drinks, I caught a small detail that confirmed what I already felt. Walter held his glass in a particular way, fingers resting lightly at the base, a habit I had seen once before. Then, as someone brushed past him, he murmured a short phrase under his breath in German. Not loudly, not for effect, just reflex. The sound hit me like a bell. Memory aligned with present reality. I looked at his name badge. It was simple. No title, no flourish, just his name, and an internal designation printed smaller beneath it. The kind you only see if you know where to look. I did not react outwardly. Inside the room rearranged itself. Frank had no idea what he had just revealed. The man he answered to was now standing within arm's reach, and I had a line of communication Frank could not imagine. Not because I was powerful in the way he understood power, but because I knew the language and the rules that governed his confidence. Frank returned to his table emboldened by his proximity to Walter. He grew louder again, buoyed by the attention he thought he commanded. He gestured toward me once more, explaining my presence like a footnote to his own importance. Walter watched without comment. He noticed everything. I saw it in the way his eyes tracked Frank's movements, and in the way his expression never changed. The pressure in my chest eased slightly. This was not the moment yet. It was the threshold. I continued working, letting the scene unfold. Frank kept talking, Kyle kept joking, Linda kept avoiding eye contact. The banquet continued around them, sponsors thanked, glasses raised, applause cued on schedule, and at the center of it all sat the man Frank answered to, quietly taking notes without a pen. If you are waiting for the moment when 3 words change the direction of the room, stay with me. It is closer than it looks. I waited for a lull that felt natural, the kind that happens when plates are cleared and conversation softens for a breath. I approached Walter with a fresh glass of water, my movement steady, my face neutral. The room was loud enough to hide small sounds, but quiet enough to amplify intention. I placed the glass where he could see it aligned with the edge of the table, and met his eyes for just a second longer than required. Then I leaned in and spoke 3 words in German. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain myself. The words were simple and precise, the kind that live in professional margins and trigger institutional reflexes. They were not dramatic. They were procedural. The effect was immediate. Walter stopped moving. His fingers released the stem of his glass and rested flat on the table. The muscles in his jaw tightened once, then relaxed. He did not look at me right away. He looked past me toward the center of the room as if recalibrating the environment. When he spoke, it was quiet and measured. Who told you that? The question landed with weight, because it assumed truth rather than accusation. I answered without ornament. It is in the paperwork. That was all. No explanation, no appeal. Walter nodded once. He picked up the glass, took a small sip, and set it down with care. Then he turned his chair slightly toward Frank. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Frank felt it before he understood it. His smile faltered. His posture straightened too quickly. Walter asked his next questions aloud, clear enough to be heard by the table and the adjacent one. Why was this not disclosed? Who signed off on it? The room did not go silent all at once. It quieted in waves like a series of doors closing. Someone at a nearby table paused mid-sentence. A server slowed to a stop. Eyes moved. Frank laughed reflexively, a sound meant to smooth edges that did not exist. He said something about timing and process, about how details get handled later. Walter did not interrupt. He waited. Silence stretched. Frank filled it poorly. Kyle leaned in, eager and unprepared, offering explanations that only widened the gap. He mentioned assumptions and standard practice. He mentioned how things are usually done. Each word added friction. Walter listened, his expression unchanged. Then he asked one more question, the kind that does not seek information but confirmation. Is there a documented waiver? Frank opened his mouth and closed it again. He glanced at Linda, who stared at the table. He glanced at me, confusion sharpening into something like fear. Walter turned slightly so others could hear him clearly. We will pause the renewal until this is cleared. The sentence was calm. It was final. It did not require emphasis. The effect rippled outward immediately. A man 2 seats away leaned back, lips pressed together. Someone across the room set down a fork. The master of ceremonies stopped smiling. Frank's face drained of color. The confidence he had carried all evening evaporated, replaced by calculation and disbelief. He tried to recover, to reframe, to suggest a follow-up conversation. Walter raised one hand gently, a gesture that signaled closure. Not now. I stood there, invisible again in the way that mattered most. No one looked at me. No one needed to. The shift had already happened. Frank's authority collapsed under the weight of questions he could not answer. He attempted to speak again, louder this time, as if volume could substitute for disclosure. It did not. Each attempt only clarified the imbalance. Kyle muttered something about misunderstanding. Linda finally looked up, her face tight with worry. The room resumed its sound slowly, but the center had moved. Walter addressed the table with professional courtesy, thanking them for their time, and noting that compliance matters benefit everyone. His tone was neutral. He did not assign blame publicly. He did not need to. The structure did it for him. Frank sat back, stunned. He avoided my eyes now. The man who had called me out for entertainment minutes earlier could not bring himself to look at me at all. As service resumed, I returned to my station. My hands shook once briefly, then steadied. I focused on tasks that required precision: clearing plates, refilling glasses. The room buzzed with restrained conversation. People speculated quietly, careful not to speculate too loudly. Frank attempted to regain composure, laughing too hard at jokes that no longer landed. He kept glancing toward Walter, who remained composed and attentive, making notes on a small pad he had taken from his jacket. The humiliation Frank experienced was not theatrical. It was administrative. His leverage was questioned. His narrative interrupted. The contract he had paraded as proof of his importance was suspended in front of peers. That kind of exposure cuts deeper than insult. It lingers. It follows you into emails and meetings and conversations you are not invited to. I caught Walter's eye once more as I passed. He gave a small nod. Not gratitude. Acknowledgement. The kind exchanged between people who understand process. That was enough. Frank did not speak to me again that night. He could not. The room had rearranged its hierarchy without permission. Kyle tried to fill the space with chatter and failed. Linda gathered her purse early, her movements tentative. When they left, it was without the performance they had arrived with. There are moments when justice does not announce itself with noise. It arrives as a question asked at the right time, in the right language, under the right rules. That night, the damage was done not by confrontation, but by exposure. Frank's breaking point had been reached, and everyone in the room felt it. Do you think Frank will apologize to Elise? Stay for the next part. The consequences did not arrive with sirens or shouting. They arrived the way adult consequences usually do in America, quietly through inboxes and calendars, through phrases like pending review and temporary hold. 2 mornings after the banquet, I was finishing a breakfast shift when my phone buzzed with a subject line that made my stomach drop, even though I had expected it. On hold. I did not need to open it to know what it meant. I opened it anyway, standing by the coffee station while someone complained about decaf like it was a personal insult. The email was short. It used careful language. It said the renewal discussion would be paused until disclosure questions were resolved. It said an internal meeting had been scheduled. It said cooperation was expected. That was the whole storm, packed into 3 paragraphs and a timestamp. By noon, the story had traveled through the way these things travel, not as facts, but as discomfort. A meeting invite started bouncing around. Then another. Frank's name appeared in the context of a review, a compliance check, a temporary reassignment. The kind of phrases people say when they want to sound neutral, while they quietly pull a chair out from under you. When the phone calls started, they were not even angry at first. They were confused. People love confusion because it allows them to pretend they are not blaming anyone yet. Linda called me that evening. She did not ask how I was. She did not mention the banquet. She started with the mortgage. She always started with whatever would make me feel responsible. Her voice sounded thin, like she had been holding it in her throat all day. Elise, she said, we are short this month. Frank is stressed. I pictured her sitting at the kitchen table in that house, bills spread out like evidence, the same table where I used to do homework while Frank explained why Kyle deserved more, because Kyle needed more. I held the phone to my ear and watched the streetlights blink on outside my apartment. I said nothing. Silence has a way of making people reveal what they actually mean. She filled it. There is a hold on his project, she said. They called him in. They said something about disclosures. I could hear Frank in the background not speaking to me, speaking about me, pacing and muttering like my name was a problem he wanted to solve without looking directly at it. Linda's voice tightened. If Frank loses that role, she said, we cannot float the payment. She meant the mortgage. She meant the house. She meant the life she had been protecting by letting everything else burn. Then Frank got on the phone. The man who had laughed at me in public now sounded careful, even polite, like he was applying for something. We need to talk, he said. Not, can we talk? Not, I am sorry, we need to talk. The need was never about me. It was about him. I kept my voice even. About what? Frank exhaled like I was being difficult, like the situation existed because I was not cooperating. Look, he said, you know him. You know Walter. You know the man. I did not correct his phrasing because that is the trick. People like Frank love to rename reality until it belongs to them. Fix it, he said. Just talk to him. Clear this up. There it was, the audacity dressed up as practicality. I waited a beat. I could hear Kyle in the background saying something sharp, probably about how I always cause problems. Frank lowered his voice like he was offering me a deal. You have always been smart, he said. You can do this. Do it for your mother. He said it the way people say do it for your family when what they mean is carry our mess so we can keep pretending you are the problem. I felt something old rise in my chest, not rage, something colder. The memory of every time I had swallowed my own hurt to keep the peace. Every time I sent money I could not spare because Linda sounded tired. Every time I told myself Frank was just stressed, Kyle was just young, I was just sensitive. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I spoke a sentence that had been forming in me for years. I did not cause this. I just stopped covering it. Silence. Then Frank's tone snapped just for a second, a flash of the real him. What did you say? I repeated it slower. I did not cause this. I just stopped covering it. Linda made a small sound, a warning like she wanted to stop the collision before it happened. Frank pushed through it. Elise, he said, you do not understand how this works. You embarrassed me. You made me look bad. That word embarrassed was the closest he could get to admitting what had happened without admitting what he had done. I let it sit. Then I said very calmly, you made yourself look bad. The paperwork did not write itself. He tried to pivot again. He always pivoted. He tried to make me responsible for his future. He tried to make the hold sound temporary if I would just do my part. He tried to sound like the reasonable adult speaking to the difficult child. You have to help us, he said. We are family. I could feel my hands shaking, not from fear but from the effort of staying quiet. The part of me that had spent years being small wanted to apologize just to end the call. That part of me wanted to offer a compromise. I recognized it now. It was not kindness, it was conditioning. So I did what I had never done with Frank. I set a boundary without decorating it. Here is what I can do, I said. I will not call Walter. I will not explain anything on your behalf. I will not attend any meeting with you. If you need to communicate with me, you can email me. If you show up at my apartment, I will not open the door. If you show up at the house, I will not come inside. Frank laughed, sharp and bitter. Oh, so now you are too good for us. I kept my tone flat. No. Now I am just done being used. Linda started crying. That was her final tool, not always intentional, but effective. "Elise," she said, "please, we are going to lose everything." I closed my eyes. For a second I saw the house the way I used to warm normal something worth saving. Then I remembered the box in the closet, my father's photos, my papers, the pieces of my past Frank had threatened to weaponize. I remembered Frank calling me a joke in a banquet room full of strangers. I remembered Linda sitting beside him, silent, as if my dignity was a reasonable sacrifice. I opened my eyes. I spoke softly. Not cruel, just final. "You should have thought about that before you turned me into entertainment." Frank's voice rose. "You are selfish. After everything we have done for you." I almost laughed, and the sound surprised me because it was small and tired and real. "What you have done for me," I said, "is let me survive around your moods. That is not the same as love." There was nothing left to say. I ended the call. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the quiet settle around me. My heart was pounding, but underneath it was something steadier than fear. Relief. The kind that comes when you stop volunteering for the role they assigned you. A minute later, a text came through from Kyle. "So you finally got what you wanted. You always hated us." I did not respond. I deleted it. Then I deleted the deleted folder. Old habit. Not because I was hiding, because I was done carrying their words in my pocket. You would think that ending a call would not feel like a turning point, but for me it did. Because the trap was familiar. Save us again. Be the quiet hero in a family that will never call you one. This time I stepped out of it. What would you do if the person who humiliated you came back demanding you rescue them? I did not announce anything afterward. I did not post. I did not explain. There was no victory lap and no audience for it, even if there had been. I went back to work, finished my shifts, and packed my things slowly and deliberately. When I moved, it was into a small apartment with thin walls and decent light, the kind of place that smells like fresh paint, and possibility at the same time. I owned very little and needed even less. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a lamp that worked. Freedom often looks unimpressive from the outside. I did not tell anyone about the resources I still kept quiet, the savings that had been built patiently, the contacts that remained unused. Not because they were secrets meant to shock, but because they were options meant to preserve choice. I chose quiet. I chose space. I chose not to turn my life into a reaction to Frank. The house did not collapse the way my mother feared. It strained. It adjusted. Frank lost standing long before he lost income. Meetings stopped, including him. Decisions were routed around him. The tone of emails changed from respectful to cautious. That kind of damage does not show up on a paycheck right away, but it lasts longer. People remember when a process fails under scrutiny. Frank learned that lesson slowly, without the drama he preferred. He did not call me again. Pride held until necessity broke it, and by then there was nothing left to negotiate. Kyle discovered that excuses do not pay balances. Without Frank shielding him, the small consequences he had always avoided arrived on schedule. Fees, missed payments, a job that did not wait for potential. He blamed everyone but himself, and for the first time, it did not matter. Linda struggled most of all, not financially at first, but internally. Silence has a cost that compounds. She had built her life around avoiding conflict, and now conflict existed without her consent. We spoke rarely. When we did, it was careful. She did not ask me to fix things anymore. She knew better now, or at least she knew enough to stop asking. In the evenings, my apartment settled into stillness. I cooked simple meals. I learned the sounds of the building and the routines of neighbors I would never know well. The absence of tension felt unfamiliar at first, like standing without leaning on something. Over time, it became steady. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I stopped bracing myself when the phone rang. There is a lie we tell people about justice, that it has to be loud to be real. The truth is quieter. Justice, the adult kind, arrives through consequences that make sense and boundaries that hold. It does not humiliate for sport. It exposes patterns and lets them stand on their own. I did not take anything from Frank. I did not ruin him. I simply stopped absorbing what he refused to carry. As weeks passed, I noticed something else change. My own voice. It steadied. It no longer rose defensively or dropped apologetically. When people asked what I did, I answered plainly. When they underestimated me, I let them. Some lessons are more effective when discovered late. There are truths that take time to settle into the body. The hardest part is not being insulted. It is realizing the people who should protect you enjoy the show. Some families do not want you to succeed. They want you to stay available. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are oxygen. I thought about my father sometimes, the box of photos now safely with me, the past no longer held hostage by someone else's temper. I thought about how easily we confuse endurance with virtue. How often women are praised for carrying what others refuse to hold. Letting go felt like disobedience at first. Then it felt like honesty. I never told Walter what his questions set in motion. He did not need to know. He did what the system required and moved on. That was the point. The moment did not belong to him or to Frank. It belonged to the rules that had been ignored and the choice to stop pretending that ignoring them was harmless. My life did not become larger after that night. It became clearer. I did not win by becoming someone else. I won by refusing to continue a role that was designed to keep me small. Peace, it turns out, has a price. It costs familiarity. It costs access. It costs the version of yourself that believes love must be earned through silence. I paid it gladly.